Welcome, everybody. My name is Barry Lynn, and I'm the Executive Director of the Open Markets Institute. And today is the second day of our three-day conference, Busting the Big Myths on Anti-Monopoly Reform. Yesterday, we addressed the question, is anti-monopoly reform bad for national security? And we did so by hosting a remarkable conversation between Senator Amy Klobuchar and General Wesley Clark. I encourage you all to watch it on our website, and we will also be sending that around to anyone who's signed up at the end of this conference. Tomorrow, we're going to host Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, Jonathan Cantor, and as well as a great panel discussion among Dina Srinivasan, Makeen Mahbood, Bruce Schneier, and Julia Engwin. And tomorrow, we're going to be looking at the question, is anti-monopoly reform bad for consumer privacy and consumer prices? Today, our question is anti-monopoly reform bad for innovation and independent business? And in about 15 minutes, we're going to have a panel discussion hosted by Edward Angueso of Vice to dig into that issue. But first, we have Special Assistant to the President, Tim Wu. I first met Tim at the bar on a party boat sailing out of Annapolis Harbor many years ago.
That's right.
Yeah. At the time, Tim and I were both fellows at the New America Foundation. And Tim was writing his book, The Master Switch, and I was writing Cornered. What I remember from that evening, and I have a pretty good memory, is that while the other fellows at that retreat were getting soused while watching the sunset, Tim and I spent more than an hour geeking out on competition policy below decks. And each of us brought something unique. I offered the ability to prove that Robert Bork's consumer welfare philosophy had unleashed many dangerous concentrations of power, and that these threaten the stability of everything from our supply chains to our democracy. And what Tim offered was a deep understanding of the history of how Americans use common carrier laws to neutralize vital networks and other providers of essential services. In other words, what Tim brought was the key to resolving the great competition challenges of the digital age. Over the years, Tim and I became very good friends, and I learned that Tim has many great gifts. As a writer, the one that most impresses me is Tim's ability to take the most complicated of legal and technical issues and to explain them in simple, elegant, energetic prose. The sort of prose that empowers people not just to see problems in a new light, but to fix them. That's why I personally, I'm so thrilled that Tim now works as Special Assistant to the President for Technology and Competition. I can imagine no person better fit for the hard job of educating an entire administration about the nature of America's monopoly crisis and what to do about it. Before his new job at the White House, Tim worked as a professor at Columbia University Law School. Previously, he served as a senior advisor to the Federal Trade Commission and as senior enforcement counsel at the New York Attorney General's office. Earlier in his career, Tim clerked for Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer and Judge Richard Posner of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which is quite the CV. Tim is a graduate of McGill University and Harvard Law School. His books include The Master Switch, The Attention Merchants, and most recently, The Curse of Bigness. I'd hold up a copy of that last book, which I strongly recommend to anyone interested in these issues. I used to have about 10 copies on the shelves behind me, but to give you some sense of how good The Curse of Bigness is, every single one of those copies has been borrowed. Anyway, it's a great honor to have Tim with us today. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Barry. That was an exceptionally generous introduction, and I appreciate it very much. At the risk of this becoming a love-in, and I didn't put this in my scripted remarks. I definitely will not only want to thank Open Markets Institute, but just include a special shout out to Barry here. I was thinking as I was preparing for this that it really was about 15 years ago when Barry was writing his first book, Cornered, which came out in 2009. That this movement, the anti-monopoly movement that is having such an effect on the American economy now really got its start. And I think Barry, frankly, is the prophet in this area. And I owe him a lot. Lena at the Lena Khan at the Federal Trade Commission, Jonathan Cantor, tomorrow's speakers. In some ways, we all sort of owe it all to Barry. So it's very much an honor to be here with him on this for this noon hour. Let me begin before addressing the main topic, which are the arguments against antitrust enforcement and some of the myths in this area. I want to make clear first where the president and frankly the Biden administration are on the topic of antitrust and competition. Back in July, when he signed the executive order on competition, the president said two things that I want to remind you of. First, he said that capitalism without competition is not capitalism, but exploitation. And second, he said that we were at this moment and in this and through this work of this executive order and administration, turning the page on a 40-year experiment with Chicago-style antitrust and the influence of figures like Robert Bork. Now, I think those two phrases really set the tone here. We have moved and are moving in a new direction, and I'll make a few indications. We've already appointed officials who are serious about enforcing the law. Most prominently, Lena Khan at the Federal Trade Commission, Jonathan Cantor at Justice Antitrust. We are also, when it comes to the promotion of competition, taking a broader all-of-government approach. This is centered in the Competition Council, which was created by the executive order. And it means, and I think this is pretty important, that all the agencies are expected by the president to march in together to do what they can to promote competition, lower barriers, promote this vision of the economy that is significantly different than what we've had over the last 20 years or so. So, you know, it's been 6 months, and frankly, a lot has already happened. I'll point to one fact that I think is significant. We have had already a significant number of major mergers challenged and abandoned. And, you know, we don't name names as sort of White House policy, but there's a major semiconductor merger, a major defense industry missile merger, insurance broker merger, sporting good merger. There's been a number of successful challenge and abandonments that I think have put us on a winning streak and have sort of reset the story for consolidation, which is really a big part of what we think has happened to the economy over the last several decades. Some of the challenges we've seen, you know, for the geeks out there have been vertical challenges. Some of them have been retroactive challenges to mergers. And I think this sets a new tone for what the rules are when it comes to trying to consolidate the economy. The age of the green light merger is over. Now, none of this is going to happen overnight, but we're talking about, you know, a transformation of consciousness, a change in a vision of what this economy can be for people. You know, what we're working towards is something more what Louis Brandeis thought the American economy could be, had been, and should be. More regional than national, with room for medium, small, and large businesses, all of them, instead of just an economy that's designed to pour the proceeds into the hands of a few. And, you know, it comes down to this question, the American vision, and it is the view of this administration that we have gone too far in one direction and need to head back towards what we can be, what we have been, and what we should be. As the president often says, we want an economy that works for everyone, and I want to emphasize that we really mean that. Let me just mention one thing that I've been working on, and our Treasury Department and our Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco has been working on, which is a report on the beer, wine, and spirits markets. And I bring that up because I think they're an interesting lesson. While those markets are not perfect, they do give us a sign of how the U.S. economy can be. For example, beer brewing has gone from an industry which consolidated all the way down to 89 breweries in the United States, where there's now over 6,000 breweries operating in the U.S., and they are regional, they're competitive, they're innovative, they come up with new beers and ideas all the time. And this is in a market that, you know, contrary to the view of some people who would say that regulation always stifles competition, these are markets that are heavily regulated. where vertical integration has been heavily, in particular, vertical integration and the most obvious exclusionary strategies have been foreclosed. And so I think this is sort of a model for what we can do and what we can expect from the U.S. economy. It doesn't have to be one way. Let me talk about a few other areas where we're changing things. Earlier this week, the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, signaled it has become very concerned about extreme consolidation of the defense industrial base and how much it costs taxpayers. And I think a very important point, Defense Department pointed out that monopoly is not just expensive, but it's also dangerous for national security. Department of Agriculture, we're very concerned about concentration in meatpacking industries. It's both seeding new competitors and rewriting its rules under the Packers and Stockyards Act. And there's a lot more, right to repair. There's the question of ocean carriage. There's railroads, you name it. There's a lot going on. But let me turn to the topic at hand and spend the rest of it on this question of antitrust and whether enforcement of the antitrust laws stifles innovation. Frankly, the answer is no. The track record of competitive innovation is very strong. And frankly, if we return to or begin to embrace a model of monopoly innovation, we will have gone in the wrong direction. And of course, that ultimately relates to antitrust enforcement. Let me back up a little bit and talk at a slightly higher level. There's two longstanding ideas or senses in which innovation happens. Theories as to which innovation happens. The first is called the bigger is better theory or monopoly innovation. And the second is called competitive innovation, or maybe small is beautiful. And as I said, the funny thing is that competitive innovation has such a better track record, you wouldn't really think there's an argument. But nonetheless, the arguments for monopoly innovation persist and in fact have come back very strong in our times. And let me give a sense of how the argument goes. The argument is that it's a bad idea to enforce the antitrust laws it's a bad idea to enforce the antitrust laws because in doing so, you'll hurt the big guys who are the ones who invent stuff. Basically, they've got all the ideas and you need to let the giants be free of distractions or irritations as they work on AI, quantum computing, or whatever. So it is basically a trust the giants approach. And to it is usually added 3 points. First, that monopoly profits earned by large companies are necessary to fund research and innovation. So if you mess with monopoly, you're messing with the sort of pipeline to research and innovation. Second, you should never or very rarely prevent a monopolist from buying a small company, a startup, because they will incubate them, they will make them better, and also you need those buyouts to reward any invested capital. And finally, when all else fails, China. If we at all annoy or distract the giants, we will lose to China. So it comes back again to do not fear monopoly, trust the monopoly, trust the giants. They know what we're doing. We just need to sit back and let it all happen. I will say that this, first of all, is an argument that I've seen many times in the history of this country. It was very big in the 19th century. Also very big in the 1960s and various 60s and 70s in various forms, and comes back periodically. It dovetails with a sort of aesthetic fascination with bigness and scale. And large companies can be very magnificent in their way, and it's in some ways only human to admire that which has become a giant. But that aesthetic fascination and the rhetoric of trust the monopoly does overlook many problems. The most obvious is that the track record of monopoly innovation is not that great. In fact, is not good at all. In countries and industries that have adopted the trust the giant approach, over time, they tend to experience stagnation, and the industry in question becomes yesterday's industry. At some point, maybe not away, at some point, the companies that are in a well-protected entrenched monopoly tend to become bloated, bureaucratic, and dysfunctional. The rot sets in. And today's dynamic darling becomes tomorrow's sluggish industry, which all too often relies on government to protect it from competition. The other problem, more in our times, more static, is that the giants have a way of eating too much. That is, they extract too much of the proceeds of the economy for themselves. The argument that we need monopoly profit for innovation and research can also just become, we need monopoly profits forever, which tends to starve the rest of the economy. Tim O'Reilly talked about a pattern of large companies, monopolies, eating their ecosystem. And I think that it's a good metaphor. There needs to be enough in the economy for everyone, and left to their own devices, every source of revenue, even if it's not even that profitable, will be taken by a company whose mandate is constant expansion. And all this, might be something if that was our only choice, but there is a better way with a better track record, even in this country, and that's competitive innovation. And that's have the orientation we talked about, an economy that creates opportunities for companies of all sizes, large, medium, small, even one man, one woman operations. So we'd posit that the alternative to trust the giants is called trust the ecosystem, or maybe even better, trust the people. And both theory and history suggest it works a lot better than trust the giants. It is in fact the American tradition. It is the one that's worked. It's the one that depends on America's comparative advantage, which is the independent spirit and inventiveness of our citizens. Backing up a little bit, from a theoretical point of view, the famous economist Kenneth Arrow made the point way back in the 60s that a monopolist actually has less inherent reason to want to challenge or change how things are. It may not want to innovate in ways that threaten its main revenue and profit streams. In contrast, when you're facing healthy competition, you actually have to improve how you do things. In this country, without naming any names, an industry where we've bet on monopoly instead of competition, it hasn't really gone too well over the long term. And also in countries, as I'll discuss in a moment, that have bet too much on their national champions, they simply have not prospered. Let's look at a case study that I'd like to put up there. Some of you may be familiar with it. Let's rewind ourselves back to the 60s and 70s. Back then, there was, in some ways, some similarities to our current environment. We had a few big, giant tech monopolies. AT&T controlled communications. IBM was the monopolist of computing. You had Boeing and aerospace. That was basically the story. And at the time, we faced a serious competitive threat from Japan, who many believed was about to seize the mantle of leadership in all matters technological from the United States. And the idea was, and similar to now, many people said, well, look at the Japanese. They've got it right. They aren't going to mess with their national champions, their giants. They're going to support them. They've got this ingenious ministry that sets the direction of the economy, and they've got it all figured out, and we're going to get hosed here. And so we could have said, and many did say at the time, all right, let's trust our giants. I don't want to interfere with them. Let's let IBM and AT&T figure it out. They're the ones who are going to invent supercomputers or AI or whatever the next thing is. And if you bother them in their laboratory, that's just going to be a big mistake. So what do we really do? Well, the antitrust division, which at that point was very active, did the opposite of trust the giants. Instead, they launched two enormous monopoly cases, Section 2 cases in the jargon, and sought explicitly the breakup of both AT&T and IBM, our giant monopolists. And quite a lot happened over the decade that followed. The cases each took about 15 years, a little less than that in case of AT&T, but a lot happened during that period. I'll just name a few highlights since we don't have all the time in the world. While justice was chasing around IBM, it stopped tying hardware to software. The software industry was born, contributing ultimately trillions in value to the US. And frankly, software is probably our leading industry at this point, well, at least one of them. Companies like Microsoft, future giants, were born during this period. Sue created room for the launch of the personal computer. Of course, the company born during this period is Apple, now the world's most valuable company. AT&T, which was broken up in 1984 into 8 companies, led, at the time, people said that's chaos, that's crazy, what are you doing? Well, what arose out of the out of the fallen company, but the internet, online networking, and some of the industries which now, as we know, are some of the most valuable industries in the world centered on the internet. The idea here is that putting pressure on the giants actually creates room for economic growth, creates room for innovation, creates room for more starts. That's what antitrust does. It creates opportunity, it aerates the economy. By metaphor to a forest, you got to let some light in to let the saplings grow. More explicitly, you're trying to discourage the creation of barriers to entry with the idea that they could create Section 2 liability or other forms of liability. Meanwhile, what happened back in Japan, they never broke up AT&T. They invested heavily in supercomputing, which everyone knew was the future, completely missed out on the personal computer, completely missed out on software, missed out on later the mobile revolution, on the app revolution. And Japan, while still a wealthy country, certainly not the threat to be the technology superpower that it once was. So I realize I've been going on for some time here, but I think that I want to close by saying that this administration is devoted to embracing that which has worked, which is competition and competitive innovation. We look back at the history of this century and we see that we have done best. We encourage our companies to compete when we force the giants to prove that they actually have what it takes, and that we don't accept the sort of easy idea that we should leave well enough alone. So that, in a nutshell, has been our policy, and that is our policy. And we believe that this is the way to both support not only innovation but independent business and ensure an economy that works for everyone. So thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity. And hand it back to you, Barry.
Hey, thank you, Tim. Just a couple quick points. I actually just want to ask you one question before you take off. I know your time is, I know you're pressed. But first, I want to thank you for bringing up, President Biden's, the executive order. I mean, I think that is an issue. That is an action, a statement, a speech that has been not really fully appreciated, the magnitude, the importance of that. So it's, I think that's, it really did set a different tone for the country and for the world in terms of competition policy. And I know you had a hand in that. And it's just wanted to note that that's something that's, I encourage people watching this to really come to understand what the importance of the executive order is. And then right after you spoke about that, you actually mentioned something. This is the question I wanted to ask you is, you said that you see a change of consciousness that's taking place. And then you connected it to the executive order, to this idea that, President Biden's statement that capitalism without competition is exploitation. That the purpose of, and he also said in that the purpose of anti-monopoly is not consumer welfare. It's not to make more stuff. It's to protect our democracy and our liberty. You said that it's, this change of consciousness. I mean, do you see that, like, connecting that to innovation? I mean, what do you see happening in this country? Just with a new way of thinking.
I think that, there's a growing sense, whether it's in the agencies, whether it's in the enforcement branches of the agency or within industry, that, the sense that we should just give more to those who have so much is not the right starting point. And it seems obvious, but it filters out into little ways. I think it's really significant. We have the Department of Defense saying, hey, listen, things have gone too far. This extreme consolidation that we've got going on is costing us a lot of money, and also starting to become a threat to national security. I think it's significant that mergers that once would have been assumed to be green lighted, vertical mergers, for example, are now being abandoned in face of challenges by the enforcement agency. I think that, in fact, I think I've been heartened by the number of small businesses that are starting, and we've been heartened by those developments. And we think that, there's a turning point. People are wanting something different out of the economy, and across all areas, just thinking, we were promised a bigger pie in the 1990s, let's say, but whatever happened to the part about dividing the pie? That never happened. And whether it's been in ways, just across, I don't want to only say antitrust, but I think that change in consciousness is really where you start to see the most profound kinds of change. And it may be manifest in things like enforcement policies, but all comes from people starting to think differently about the economy and what it's supposed to do for us. So maybe I'll leave it there. And thank you again.
Hey, well, thank you, Tim. This is really terrific, and it was great to have you today. That was an important statement, and we will be in touch soon, and look forward to working with you in the days and years ahead. But so I'm going to turn now to the panel, and we have a really terrific sort of host for our panel discussion. And I'm going to leave it to our host, who's Edward Angueso, to introduce the different members of the panel, but I will introduce Edward. And just got to know Edward the last few days, but I have heard about Edward's work for a while, and it is a great honor for us to have Edward with us. So Edward Angueso Jr., he's a New York-based reporter, and he covers labor and technology for Motherboard, which is Vice News' technology section. Most of Edward's work has focused on app-based gig labor platforms, antitrust and anti-monopoly law, labor movements, capital markets, surveillance technologies, and cryptocurrency. At Hampshire College, Edward's thesis focused on Uber's business model and featured an ethnography of app-based ride-hail and taxi drivers in New York City, as well as a history of deregulation and privatization and related capital and labor markets. Just personally, I'm very impressed by that as an undergraduate set of body of work, because I was, my own undergraduate degree was very far removed from that. Edward previously worked as an organizer to help pass the country's first ride-hail vehicle license cap and a minimum pay rate for drivers in New York City. Edward hosts a weekly podcast on technology and political economy called This Machine Kills. So it's great to have Edward here, and over to you, Edward.
Oh, sorry, I was muted there. Thanks for the introduction, Barry. Today's panel, I think, is going to be a good one. We'll be talking about some of the myths around antitrust reform and whether or not whether antitrust reform can interfere with competition, with innovation, some of the myths that are usually deployed by monopolists. Joining us on the panel, we're going to have Angela Hoover, who is the co-founder and CEO of AndySearch, which is a free and anonymous search engine that is ad-free and fights spam. AndySearch's overarching mission is to, quote, unbreak the internet, and its immediate aim is to provide search results superior to those of its competitors. Hoover worked with Microsoft on Azure and founded a travel influencer startup. She also has a background in site compliance, cloud computing, e-commerce, and teaching business. Gina Schaefer is the founder and CEO of A Few Cool Hardware Stores. That's a chain of neighborhood Ace Hardware stores in the greater DC area, the greater Washington area. Schaefer has grown her company from 1 to 13 stores in 18 years, and her big passion is for developing urban markets, supporting small businesses, and helping women to succeed in the hardware industry. She is tirelessly focused on the return to Main Street movement in Washington, D.C. to promote shop local campaigns and community revitalization in urban areas. And Gina is also a member of the Small Business Rising and serves on the board of the Institute for Local Surf Alliance. Ben Gross is the Chief Strategic Officer for Media Lab, a management platform for healthcare cloud systems. Previously, he was the Chief Strategy Officer and General Counsel for Genius, which is billed as, quote, the world's largest collection of song lyrics and musical knowledge. Gross has written before about Google's ruinous power for the Washington Post. He graduated from Yale Law School and now lectures at Columbia Law School. So I think, it's really great to have you all here. We can jump right into it. I would love the first question I have sort of directed at Ben and Gina, which is basically, would love to hear, maybe in a few minutes, you could summarize your sort of experiences with Google and Amazon, respectively. I mean, Ben, you worked at Genius, which had 2 lawsuits against Google for anti-competitive practices, essentially. And at Media Lab, where you're working at healthcare or cloud-based healthcare systems, I'm sure that Amazon and Google, to an extent, are also trying to get into that sector. But also, Gina, you are running a chain of neighborhood brick and mortar stores, and Amazon has been pretty keen on, over the past decade, a pretty concentrated assault and campaign against physical retail locations and figuring out ways to compete against them or drive them out of business. So I'd love to hear, what sort of encounters or experiences y'all have had with these 2 companies as you've been trying to, develop or grow your own businesses.
Sure, I'm happy to start. One clarification, I think you got the wrong Media Lab. Media Lab that I now work at is actually the company that acquired Genius and is a holding company of digital media brands.
Okay.
So we're still in the fight with Genius here. But yeah, with respect to Genius's contact, it would take a while, and I'll try not to go on for too long. Genius' contact with Google has been going on for almost a decade now. It really began right when I started, and Google, for good reason, actually, removed Genius from Google search because some folks at the company had sort of been engaged in a kind of illicit link building strategy or whatever. But and that was a totally legitimate thing that Google did, and it was we cleaned it up, and we got our sort of place in Google restored, because folks, the vast majority of users who come to Genius come via Google search. But what it really showed and was a preview of was just the immense power that Google has to just destroy a small company. It's like when that happened, and Ed, you might even remember when that happened. If it wasn't resolved in a matter of weeks or months, let alone several months, if it had gone on for much longer than it did, which was probably only about a month, Genius would have vanished probably, because it would, there was no more audience, which meant no more revenue and no more company. And so that was pretty scary, shot across the bow from Google. And then subsequently, and what I think the reason probably I'm here is that Genius is home to lyrics transcriptions. If you Google lyrics, you often end up on Genius. You've probably been there, even if you're not sure you have. And those transcriptions, contrary to what many people believe, are not. So there's no canonical home for lyrics transcriptions. The publishers and the labels that own music copyrights don't actually have the lyrics at hand, and the lyrics websites like Genius have to create them. They have to be transcribed, and they're transcribed by Genius's community of music fans. Every day they're just, music comes out Thursday night, and people are, working together and arduously listening to the latest tracks that are released to transcribe them and get them out on Genius so that people can see the lyrics and annotate them and explain them. And what we noticed a few years ago was that Google started displaying lyrics at the top of the search results for when you search for, song lyrics. If you search for, Born to Run lyrics, Google will now show you lyrics above the organic search results. And we started to notice that for certain songs, especially for hip hop music, that the transcriptions Google was showing were identical, suspiciously identical to the transcriptions on Genius. And because music, and especially hip hop music, is pretty intricate, it's very unlikely that they were creating those transcriptions in our view. And it seemed like they were most likely copying them from Genius and depriving us of the audience that we would get if people would click through to Genius. And so we planted a little trap for them where we embedded in the lyrics to many songs across the site a hidden pattern. We changed certain apostrophes to a different Unicode apostrophe in a very specific pattern. And we knew that if they were copying our lyrics as we suspected, that those strange apostrophes would carry over into the Google search results. And we did that in a pattern of such that the strange apostrophes represented dots versus the regular apostrophes dashes, and it spelled out in Morse code a secret message for Google, which was red-handed. And sure enough, it was all over Google. We found this watermark, what we call a watermark, all over Google. We confronted them about it, and maybe we'll get deeper into this. We can talk about it more, but just essentially, they didn't give a shit. Excuse my language. They didn't care, and they claimed they would investigate. They claimed that publicly that they were concerned, but they did absolutely nothing other than remove the evidence of the copying. They stripped the watermark, left the lyrics. They didn't know that we had another secret watermark that was in the same songs that had the first watermark. So it was just evident that they were just trying to conceal their bad behavior. And ultimately, we couldn't get anywhere with this. And we had no sort of choice but to try to sue Google, basically for anti-competitive behavior and breach of contract. And that suit is ongoing. And to this day, and I'll shut up now, like to this day, Google's position in the case, and not really publicly when they've talked about this in the press, but in the case, the position that they put forward is that they have not denied en masse copying lyrics from Genius and displaying them in their search results without our permission, and to the great detriment of our business. And their position is essentially, if we did this, there's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing that stops us from doing that. And sorry if that means that Genius can't exist anymore. So that's the short or medium length history of Genius's contact with Google, and it hasn't been a pleasant one.
Oh, Gina, what about your contact with Amazon?
Yeah, so, well, I got myself so wrapped up in that story and getting angry, I couldn't even remember. I was speechless. So I just want to reiterate that I represent Small Business Rising, which is a coalition of over 150,000 small businesses. So it's not just me, this little retailer in Washington, D.C. that is trying to lead this fight. I also have started selling my business to my employees, which I think is a way for my teammates to build generational wealth and for us to work on just a whole host of societal ills. And so I really feel like my voice is for those employees that I work with who are now also my co-owners in this business. But years ago, when I started worrying about Amazon specifically, it was really just because they were putting bookstores out of business. And I don't think I could look down the road and see how far they could go. But I found myself in some of these conversations over the last couple of months, really thinking about the true threat that they now pose to brick and mortar. And so coming out of what was just the concern of being on the internet to Main Street USA and what that means to communities. So, from the logistical standpoint, everybody knows this, but they have increasingly, Amazon specifically, has increasingly controlled the supply chain, whether that means the shipping routes and how they can purchase them, or control when and how things are shipped because they have more shipping power, for example, than small distribution centers, or than what small retailers might need, to controlling the backbone. And so I often wonder, if Ace Hardware is a national cooperative, but if, for example, Ace decided one day to do business over AWS and AWS goes down, what is the ripple effect of them now controlling that commerce backbone that we all rely on as small business owners? And so there's that whole, in the Ethernet kind of realm. But what has really started to strike home is the brick and mortar reality that is becoming Amazon. So you mentioned they've put small businesses out of business for a decade now. And what they've realized, because they can track everyone's data and purchasing, particularly through their Prime program, is that they know exactly where people are buying and they know what they need. And so now, because of the stretch that we have on the shipping channels, for example, they can just open a brick and mortar in a neighborhood where they know there's a need. And so my office is in Logan Circle in Washington, D.C. It's where my flagship store is. We've been there for 18 years. I employ a tremendous group of people and do a lot of community outreach and engagement. And now from my office, I can see 2 Amazon stores. And so the reality of that then becomes, driving up rent and municipalities in some cases, or landlords thinking that they are going to be the savior of, whatever the next retail iteration is. And my concern is, where does that leave small businesses like mine that do a couple things? One, we are in the community, like I said, actively engaging with the community. 2, we are hiring people. I think of those 2 retail spots, and this is a small subset, but they have 3 or 4 employees. The Amazon model of the future, and I don't mean to sound like a Luddite. I certainly am all for technology. Hardware is a little bit of an antiquated industry when it comes to technology, but their purpose is to figure out how to eliminate people from the workforce. And so, you have a Prime account, you don't need to talk to anybody, you don't need to exchange any cash, you just walk in and out of a business, therefore they don't need people. And so I think about a neighborhood like Logan Circle that has come back from the riots that destroyed it decades ago, and became this very vibrant place, and now has all these dark storefronts. Yes, I want businesses to open back up in those dark storefronts, but when they don't employ people, and then when they're not engaged in the community, are we really doing the community any sort of service? So that's kind of the brick and mortar hat that I wear. And then, obviously I have hundreds of vendors that I deal with in my business on a day-to-day basis. And I hear the stories that they have to deal with, the price changes from Amazon, the increased fees, the search engine where their Amazon's knockoff product, for example, goes higher than my product that I've sold on Amazon. Not me, I'm giving an example, obviously. For months and months and months now, all of a sudden Amazon has created their own private label product of that item, and now it shows up higher, and that small business owner starts to lose. And so I think when their lobbyists come to Washington or wherever it is that they go, they talk about how they're creating this platform where millions and millions of eyeballs are seeing what these small makers are making. But the story that they don't tell is how quickly those folks, when they're successful, move to the bottom of the search, and how quickly they're knocked off or counterfeited. To whose gain, I wonder. So I'm going to stop because I'll get really excited and just talk about a whole bunch of other things that I find really frustrating. But I think that, now that Amazon is looking to grow their brick and mortar presence, it's going to be a bigger threat to small business, which is obviously stands against everything Small Business Rising is trying to do, and that I personally am trying to do with building community-based hardware stores.
Yeah, I think like building up on both of your points, and I'll probably direct this question to Angela. There is this sense that the ways in which these businesses have interacted, these monopolists have interacted with you, is that they've limited. Well, I mean, they've also had a real effect on whether or not businesses can start or flourish, but also limited prospects on the ground, for people who are looking for a job or looking to start their own sort of business, but also maybe structuring, influencing the way that people imagine that they can be used in the first place. Like, what should be the role of some large platform or some e-commerce platform, or what should be the role of this search engine in people's daily lives, or what should be the role of like this or that firm that is providing some digital good or service. And I think for Angela, your search engine, I would be interested in hearing, one, why you think that your model of doing search would be a better, superior one to competitors, but also, what do we lose, or what have we lost, or forsaken in having Google's vision for search kind of dominate, and the scale at which it's able to throw its power around to limit or kill competitors, or limit the way in which they develop or innovate search engine methods.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Edward. First, I really want to start with the problem. And the problem is that search is broken. It hasn't improved in 20 years. And at the end of the day, Google's an ad tech company, not a search company. it employs 3 times the amount of people on ads as it does search. And all of us consumers at this point are the product, not the customer. And as a result, search results now are mostly ads, clutter, and SEO spam. And really, they're optimized to drive paid clicks. And ad tech is essentially malware. It's intrusive and creepy, and it rewards misinformation and clickbait. And so people have lost trust in big tech because it feels like Big Brother, selling you out to the highest bidder. And so with Andy, what we're trying to do, if you can imagine using an internet where you can read and watch content that isn't stuffed with advertising, and imagine high quality journalism and content that have more funding and rank higher than clickbait, and then getting the best information quickly so you don't waste hours, searching through irrelevant information that was just pushed up because of SEO tactics. So in my opinion, I think our society would be much better off if people can get genuinely higher quality content and get the actual answers that they're looking for and answers that are truthful to the customer. And I can talk more on this if you want to ask a follow-up question.
Yeah, I think I would then be, interested, and maybe this feeds into like questions for all 3 of you. There are various areas in which, Google, Amazon, some other monopolists you may have interacted with has put up barriers that prevent other, startups or other businesses from starting or flourishing in the first place, but also prevent them from getting critical mass or from developing alternatives or from those alternatives getting, eyeballs looking at them and people interested in using them. I would love to hear a bit about what are some of the barriers that y'all have seen or encountered firsthand, or would like to talk about and think that are issues in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the big tech monopoly stranglehold over distribution, especially, is the single biggest barrier in innovation in this country today. And, I think people forget Google and Apple control what people can use on their phone and on their desktop, the products that are sold in America. And so it's far more pervasive than anything, John D. Rockefeller could have ever even dreamt about. They're dead weight on innovation getting in front of consumers. And it's because they control the distribution that it's so hard for up and coming startups who are trying to innovate in this space can really, try to get market share.
Oh, you're muted.
I got it. I would add to that, just from my perspective, a huge sort of barrier and obstacle it's created that people don't always necessarily recognize by companies like Google and Amazon is the sort of the fear element that is generated by their market power in the sense that I think probably in ways that I imagine past monopolists couldn't really dream of, every potential competitor in almost any business line that these companies are in is relying simultaneously on their products, because they reach into every element of what it is to run a company, certainly a digital company, and almost any kind of company at this point. To this day, it's there aren't a lot of small companies that are willing to call out the kinds of behaviors that interfere with innovation and ultimately jeopardize the survival of small companies, because it's scary. It's scary because to this day, Genius relies on Google for the vast majority of our traffic. We rely on Google's ad products for the vast majority of our revenue. We rely on YouTube, which Google owns, for the vast majority of our audience for our video content. And so, it was a little scary getting, to get too adversarial with these guys, because they have an enormous number of levers that are, critical to the way we run our company. And I think that generates a certain level of impunity on the part of the monopolists, because they don't get as much pushback as they should from as many small companies because of, I think, at least in my view, because of this kind of fear and this obstacle that they're everywhere, and like confronting them is a potentially dangerous game.
I think, just to piggyback on that, they don't get any pushback from government at most levels. So just as an example, when Amazon was interested in putting their next headquarters somewhere, and I'm sure all of you read everything, Edward, you might have written about it, but cities just opened the doors and said, this is all the data that you need in order to choose us, come to our city. This is what people are spending, what they make, what they're buying, what they're lacking, what's not here, what we will give you. And it's that give, I think, that makes it so concerning for me. For years, they didn't have to make any money. They didn't have to pay any taxes. And people would come in and they would say to me, you're more expensive by X. Well, that X was the tax that they wouldn't have to pay when they bought something on Amazon. But now it's, at least I've seen it in Washington, it's fed into all of the media. That's all the media wants to talk about. So when is there an opportunity to talk about the celebrations that are happening on the small business level, unless we're seen as charity? And that's where I think the leveling of the playing field will really come in handy, will really be beneficial. I don't want small businesses to be seen as charity. That's not what we are. But we don't want the government to hand over, everything to the competition because they're bigger and they're seen as the only option, to give space to woo, to whatever it is, to bring them into town. I think that is a concern for me, and I think that it's something that's not talked about enough as well.
Yeah, I would think, we're coming up on time, so maybe I would love to ask as a sort of, closing out question to all of y'all. There's a sort of, and Wu talked about this a bit in the introduction, there's a sort of fascination with bigness, compiled with beliefs that people may have or that have been propagated about the convenience, the benefits of having large centralized operations that dominate entire industries across the country. So maybe, stepping back, and asking for each of y'all, what are some of the, overlooked consequences of deciding to forego, local or regional or small or medium-sized businesses instead of having these large platforms or these large monopolists come in and offer service maybe to everyone, right? And crowding out all the competitors, and maybe providing lower prices, but doing so after getting lobbying power, after getting bargaining power, after scaling up in a way that leaves nothing else for anyone else.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think I just listening to Tim Wu talking about this monopoly theory of innovation is sort of, just at least from my perspective, from our experience, was just it's funny because it's, to your question, Ed, it's like in the very narrow case of Genius and the production of transcriptions of songs, which is a big part of what Genius does, and the work that Google is declining to do when they appropriate the work that happens on Genius. The consequences, the hidden consequences that you're asking about, are that it's explicitly Google is declining to innovate. It's a complicated problem to figure out how to get fast and accurate transcriptions of complicated music available to people at scale in a fast way. It's a collaborative process on Genius. It's pretty sophisticated software. It required a lot of innovation to put together the platform that made this happen. And Google has declined to innovate and figure out how to do that themselves. We would, it would be scary if they got too deep into that, but that's not what they're doing. They instead have decided they're just going to forego that innovation, and they're going to free ride on the work of a company that is infinitesimally small compared to Google. And the consequences of, in the sort of metaphor of not shopping locally, of just relying on the Google one box and instead of clicking through to Genius at this point, is that eventually those lyrics will not be available because Google's not producing them. They're not innovating any way to replace Genius. They are free writing on Genius, and if unchecked, and Genius were to disappear because Google, swallowed all of our revenue and made it impossible for us to operate, those transcriptions would no longer be produced, and they would no longer be available to steal. They would just be gone, and the quality of the experience of an internet user and a music fan would go down accordingly. And so, like, yeah, this notion that, like, monopoly power that allows Google to behave the way it does with respect to Genius their sort of innovation benefits. It's like they're explicitly declining to innovate, and to the great ultimate detriment of music fans, of innovation, of sort of the way the internet should work. And so, like, yeah, there's I think that the costs are considerable, and there's no there's no evidence to me that anyone is reaping a ton of benefits from Google's monopoly power.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, from my perspective, I think it goes back to what Ben was mentioning before and what Tim was mentioning previously too, is that competition at the end of the day does foster and drive innovation in this space. And from my perspective, working, as a team of two on a small search engine startup, to have, the consumers have the option to be able to switch and choose, it gives them those choices that they don't have today. And the problem isn't that just Google is the default because they're a monopoly. It's that the search results are actually getting worse. And more, they're prioritizing profits over people. And so, this at the end of the day is no longer benefiting the consumer, it's benefiting the advertiser. And if you think about Google, it's honestly the most concentrated large market in the history of mankind. And from Andy's perspective, we don't want to be locked out of a market by a company that has less innovation just because they own the rails. We want to be in a competing open market, and the American Innovation and Choice Online Act would help that immensely. And at the end of the day, I believe in a future where consumers have easier ways to switch and choose.
I just want to add that the same goes for pricing for the consumers. When the monopolies get stronger, there is no balance to the pricing that the consumer is served when they see products. When there aren't any more options, they don't have that. They don't have the price choices that they would get otherwise, which I think is going to be really stressful down the road. And then also just jobs in general. I mean, I know that the big tech companies will tell you that they employ hundreds of thousands of people. But those people aren't in our communities, in our main streets, in our downtowns, making vibrant places to live. They're in distribution centers. They're in, headquarters centered in just a couple parts of the United States. And I think from a jobs perspective, it's also leaving a lot to be concerned about with the lack thereof, if this is the way we continue.
Yeah, and I think that pretty much brings us to a close. I want to thank all of you for talking to us today. This was a really great conversation, especially to hear, thoughts and ways forward about what to do with some of these monopolists. I'll hand it over to Barry, and he can take us home.
Thank you, Edward. And thank you all. This was a really helpful conversation, a really useful conversation, a really practical conversation. And, it gave people a sense of what it's like to actually be in business in America in the year 2022, when pretty much everywhere you look, you see monopolies somewhere around you. So just in sort of summarizing what we heard today, I mean, we had, Tim at the beginning of the day, he said that, America is the land of opportunity, or at least In theory, it is, and for periods of time, it has been. And what Tim also said is that anti-monopoly is the tool that we have used in America to make that opportunity. And just even more broadly, that anti-monopoly is the tool that we have used to make the kind of country and the kind of communities that we all want to live in, the kind of people that we ourselves want to be. And then what did we hear from the panel? We heard that today in America, with all these monopolies around us, with Google and Facebook and Amazon everywhere, there is little to no opportunity, no real opportunity. Instead, what we actually see, and let's be blunt about what we see mass theft by Google, Facebook, Amazon, and a few other large platforms. They steal other people's businesses. They steal other people's money. They steal other people's opportunity. They steal other people's lives. Ben told that story about sort of encoding the word red-handed in the lyrics. When you're Google, when you're Amazon, you got 100 million, you got 1 billion hands with which to reach into people's pockets. So they're red-handed times 100 million. They're red-handed times 1 billion. Mass theft. As Angela put it, what we see is something that's far more pervasive, a monopoly that's far more pervasive than anything John D. Rockefeller could ever dream of. The most concentrated market in history is what she said. And let's be clear, this is also political, as Ben put it, this kind of power makes people afraid, even as they're getting their properties, their opportunities stolen from them. They're afraid to speak out because they're afraid of retribution that will make it worse. So as just coming back to what Tim said at the beginning, the question for us all today is what kind of country, what kind of society do we want to live in? And what we do have a tool that allows us to make the kind of society that I believe we do want to live in, the kind of democracy, the kind of inclusive democracy, the kind of open society, the kind of competitive, the competitive society that gives everybody the opportunity to make themselves who they want to be. We have that tool, and it's in our anti-monopoly laws. So thank you all again. It's a really great conversation. And just to, sort of walk us out of here, today was the second of our 3 days of conferences. Yesterday, we had a conversation with Senator Amy Klobuchar and General Wesley Clark, looking at the ways in which anti-monopoly reform can help promote U.S. national security. Tomorrow, we're going to have our final conference of our 3 days with Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, Jonathan Cantor, and we're going to be looking at the ways in which anti-monopoly reform can promote consumer privacy and promote sort of lower prices. And today we had a really fantastic conversation about how anti-monopoly reform can empower innovators, can empower our independent business people to make better businesses that serve all of us and make a better world in which all of us can live. So I want to thank all of the panelists today. I want to thank Edward for being a generous and excellent host, and Angela and Gina and Ben, just great stories. And I want to thank Tim again. It was a great honor to have Tim Wu with us today. So see you all tomorrow at noon for the third and final day of our 3-day conference.